Hello everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to everybody here in the room and also to those of you joining us online for today's event, Powering Carbon Neutrality by 2050. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based here in Brussels and I'm coming at you live from the heart of the EU quarter in the Euractiv studios, just next to the European Council Summit where the 27 national leaders of the EU are busily in their discussions. And we know that over the past 2 years, or past 3 years really, a lot of those discussions have revolved around energy. Energy has really propelled to the forefront of the big political discussions in Europe, so much so that the fact that energy is missing from their agenda today is actually remarkable in and of itself. But that doesn't mean the discussion isn't happening because, of course, just across town, we had the Nuclear Energy Summit that was convened by the Belgian presidency, which saw a huge number of national leaders speaking there, talking about the future trajectory of energy, particularly when it comes to nuclear. But of course, we know nuclear is not the only energy issue that people are discussing. People are wondering, how do we increase the EU's energy security and how do we combat climate change in the most cost-effective and sensible way? Now, we know we've just had this whole raft of EU legislation adopted as part of the Fit for 55 package, which implements EU President Ursula von der Leyen's Green Deal. And so now people are thinking, what's next? We've got a big implementation period coming up in front of us, and people are wondering, how do we meet these ambitious goals that have just been set? And so as this debate unfolds about that future trajectory, it becomes more and more clear that the path to realizing this vision is laden with intricate challenges, and this demands a meticulous examination of the economic, industrial, and social considerations involved. So today, we're going to talk about what is needed to develop the technologies to get to net zero and facilitate the decarbonization of every sector of our economy. And during this event, French utility EDF will share its most recent scenario and vision of the necessary steps ahead. So to get us started, I would like to welcome to the podium Marion Labattu, who is EU Affairs Director for EDF. Marion?
Welcome and thanks for coming here to discuss our EDF scenario. It's actually the first time that EDF will present in a public manner a net zero scenario. So we are actually very excited today to have this presentation for the first time here in Brussels. Lots of analysis and lots of modeling has gone into producing this scenario, and I would like to extend a heartfelt thanks to the colleagues from the strategy division, all the analysts and the management who threw a huge amount of work in preparing for this event. Why are we doing this and doing this now? So we're all preparing for the next European cycle. The work on the trajectory to reach net zero at the European level is starting. We've all seen the communication from the European Commission on the 2040 milestone. So we feel it's the right time to discuss and identify the key levers and the elements of the regulatory framework that will enable the market developments, the investments, and also the behavioral changes that will take the EU to net zero. So why us? Well, EDF is the European leader in decarbonized electricity. We're actually the global leader in decarbonized electricity, 37 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour in 2023. That's actually very, very low. So we want to chip in today in an open way and present this EDF scenario. Today is a very special day. There is a historical nuclear summit here in Brussels that shows that nuclear is definitely back in the game. Today in Bilbao, we also have the Wind Europe conference where they announced this morning that investments have doubled in wind power in 2023 and that permitting is also on the rise. So we see some very interesting synergies there, but I will not spoil the scenario. Thanks to all the high-level panelists who accepted to kickstart this debate, and we will of course be very happy to follow up with all the stakeholders and policymakers in town, but also outside of town to discuss more in detail our findings and this scenario. I would like to conclude the introduction, by saying that our conviction at EDF is that the EU must stay on course in the fight against climate change in a very determined and steady way. So with this, thank you very much for being here, for engaging with us, and I leave the floor to the speakers. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marion. Okay, so now we're going to get to the presentation. 2 notes before we get to that. First of all, on your seats, you will have had this piece of paper there. There's a QR code on it, so if you want to access the slides that are about to be presented, if, for instance, it's easier for you to read than on the screen, just scan that, scroll down to the bottom, and you can see a place where you can download the slides from the presentation. Also, you're going to be able to ask your questions about the presentation by putting them into Slido. That's the way we're going to do all questions here today. So if you see this QR code on the screen, go ahead and scan it with your smartphone and you can put in questions on there. I'll read them out to the panelists. So if you have specific questions about the presentation, make that clear in your question, and I'm going to put them to Charles, who we'll hear from in just a moment, after the presentation. Again, that's for technical questions about the presentation. Then there will be an opportunity for more general questions about the topics discussed at the end of the panel. So you can go ahead and start putting those questions in now, and I'll put them to whoever you have directed them to. So enough of that. Let me now introduce Charles Wehmüller, who is the chief economist for the EDF, who is going to walk us through this scenario. Charles?
So thank you very much, Dave, for this, and thank you all for participating to this discussion. So the first part of this event is to actually share with you the results of our detailed analysis on how to reach net zero. The starting point of our analysis is that it is not going to be easy. There are a lot of challenges. Dave, you mentioned it, social ones, industrial ones, economic ones. And to be explicit, there will be a cost, an aggregate cost of the transition. What we imply from that is not that we should give up on climate ambition. Quite the opposite, actually. We are fully aware that the alternative, which is climate inaction, would be actually even costlier. What we imply from that is that we need to minimize the cost. We need to be as cost-effective, as efficient, as optimized as possible, to minimize the aggregate cost of the transition. So this is what we are going to propose to you. It is a technical and an economic analysis, an economic optimization to reach net zero in a cost-effective way. We build on the expertise of all EDF group, and this expertise is built on studies, but also on real-world experience in the energy sector, in electricity in particular, but even more broadly. So let's start with a bird's eye view of our results. What you see on the slide, on the left-hand side, is basically the pathway to reach net zero that gets out of our analysis. We take it as a given that we have to be net zero in 2050. It is an objective that we do not discuss. It is about climate science. Climate science tells us that we need to be net zero at 2050. We take it for granted. What we do is that we optimize under these constraints the way to basically minimize the cost of the transition. What you see is that all sectors will have to contribute. So the burden sharing of that cost basically will have to affect all sectors. And on the right, what you see is that the energy sector is at the heart of this transition. It is at the heart of the radical transformation we need. And when I say energy sector, it is both the energy demand and the energy supply. So what you see on the right, the key figures of our scenario, is going to be my roadmap. I will go through each of those. And before that, a quick note on methodology. What we are doing is that we are modeling explicitly all the energy sector of 15 European countries. So it's not exactly EU 27. We are including the United Kingdom because it has a key role to play in the energy transition for Europe as a whole. And we miss some countries of the EU 27, but in terms of order of magnitude, what I'm going to say is valid for the EU 27 as a whole. Second point is that we do take into account a number of feasibility constraints. That it is a normative approach because we take it as a given that we have to be net zero in 2050. That said, we also take into account explicitly a number of physical, technological, societal constraints to make the scenario as realistic as we can. Third, the optimization is basically driven by welfare maximization, cost minimization, but also resilience. We want to build a resilient scenario to a number of risks. And what gets out of this modeling is basically the strategy on the left-hand side of the slide. It is a strategy that relies on two pillars. The first pillar is to reduce energy demand, because the best energy we could think of is the energy that we actually do not consume. And the second pillar is to produce the remaining energy we will need in a fully decarbonized way. So let's start with the first pillar. First pillar is how to reduce energy demand. So to be precise, it is final energy demand. It's like the consumption of energy in our final uses. The bad news is that this final energy demand is going to go up initially if we do not do anything else because of the general context, because of macroeconomics, because of demographics. Between 2021 towards 2050, the final energy demand will actually go up, slightly up. This is the first brick, the red brick. To counteract this trend, we actually need to activate three levers. The first one is behavioral changes. The way we live, the way we heat ourselves, the way we move, we can act on that. We can change our way of life, our standards of living, our habits. That said, we account for it only by 10% of the decrease we want to achieve. Why is that? Because we want to stay realistic. We are fully aware that it is also a sensitive issue, politically, socially. So this is why we are pretty conservative on the amount of behavioral changes we are integrating in our scenario. Second lever, electrification. So this is the bulk of the decrease. 60% of the decrease we are trying to achieve will come from electrification. Electrification is a change of equipment. This is when you move from gas boiler to heat pumps, when you move from combustion cars to electric vehicle. And when you do so, you actually slash your energy consumption because it is energy efficient to move towards electrification. Third, energy efficiency above and beyond electrification. Electrification is already an energy efficient action, but above and beyond that, you can still optimize. You can still optimize the way you heat yourself. Typically, when you renovate your house, it's actually energy efficient. So all that is going to sum up to minus 40% of energy demand. Focus on electrification priorities, because as you've seen, this is the bulk of the decrease. So we need to be very concrete and proactive on how to electrify. And here, basically, we have three priorities, three sectors we want to electrify in priority. The first two ones are all about massification. So for buildings and transportation, the name of the game is to massify mature technologies. We know the technologies is basically electric vehicles, not just light, but also for heavy transportation. And for buildings, it is basically heat pumps. Those two technologies do exist. We need to deploy them to accelerate the deployment of those technologies all over Europe. The third priority is actually about industry. And here, it is a different ballgame, because here, the technologies do not exist yet. At least they are not mature as the former two ones. And still, it is a priority, because if we do not do that, industry will reinvest into carbonized processes, and then they will be locked in because lifetime of those processes, of those equipment, are typically 20 to 30 years. And so it will be too late. We will miss the 2050 targets if we wait for the next reinvestment cycle to decarbonize. So my takeaway is that industry is also a priority for electrification, along with buildings and transportation. Now let's move to the second pillar, energy supply, because as we have seen, we have slashed our final energy demand by 40%. There's still 60% of today's final energy that have to be addressed by energy production, and this energy production will have to be fully decarbonized. So the first ingredient I'm going to put in our energy supply mix are actually electrons, because here it is a double effect of the electrons. Not only they slash your energy demand, but it also slash your CO2 emissions. So typically, we know how to decarbonize our power mix. I will come back to that. And provided we do so, it is a very, very efficient, from a climate standpoint, energy vector. And so this is why, in our scenario, the share of electrons in our final energy demand will grow from 21% today towards 57% in 2050. So this is a very high number. It comes with changes, but this is the priority. That said, 57% is not 100%. So the remaining 43% will have to be addressed with other energy vectors. Other ingredients we'll have to put in our cocktail, in our mix, to really reach net zero and a fully decarbonized energy mix by 2050. So the second ingredient I want to put in our mix is heat. Heat is definitely not yet decarbonized, but is pretty easy to fully decarbonize by 2050. That said, it is still a bit costly, and there are physical constraints. So this is why the share of heat, so basically heat, you have geothermal solutions typically, and district heating. And the share basically only increased from 4% to 7%. Third ingredient, after electrons and heat, are molecules. And molecules will still have a major role to play in our long-term decarbonized energy mix. And here we can think of three types of molecules, three types of technologies that can fully decarbonize molecules production. The first type are bioenergies, biofuels. So those ones are great from an energy standpoint, but they come with a challenge, which is actually limited resources and conflict of uses. Where when you use biomass for energy, it is biomass that you do not use for other uses. And so this is tricky, and we need to be parsimonious. We need to be targeted in our way we use bioenergy. Second kind of decarbonized molecule we can think of are synthetic molecules. So molecules basically that we do produce typically out of electricity. So hydrogen, heat fuels, derivatives from hydrogen, ammonia, are all in that category. Here, it is a solution, and it has a role to play in our cocktail, but it comes also with a challenge, which is a high energy requirement. So the way we produce those synthetic molecules is actually costly in terms of energy, and that will translate into a cost in terms of economics of that solution. So this is why also we are targeted in our use of molecules, this kind of molecules, and we focus their use on international transportation and industry as a feedstock. Final and third type of decarbonized molecule we can think of are the actual fossil fuel molecules we know today, but combined with captured carbon and storage. And in that case, it is conceivable. It has a role to play in our mix, but it also comes with a challenge, which is that CCS, carbon capture, is not a mature technology yet. Plus, we keep a dependency on fossil fuel in that case. To wrap up our cocktail, so the fully decarbonized mix we have in 2050 is basically the one you see on the right. So 57% 60% comes from electrification, and the remaining 43% comes from a cocktail of the other ingredients. What I take away from that is that it is a no-brainer to push electrons, because we know this is fully efficient, whereas for the other ingredients, there is a lot of uncertainty in the respective share they will play in the fully decarbonized mix. So now let's dive into the production of electrons. So this is a new mix, so a new pie, but this time it is the pie on how to produce those electrons in a fully decarbonized way. In our scenario, we take it as a given that it will be fully decarbonized, plus we optimize the cost of producing those electrons. So this is why what you see, not only the pie is growing, actually there's an increase of plus 80% of power production from 2021 towards 2050. So it is a massive increase in power production. And it is also a massive change in the share of the different technologies. Typically today, 60% of our power mix is decarbonized, which is not too bad. So we should pride ourselves to have already achieved that. Still, there's 40% of our power mix which relies on carbonized processes, typically coal plants and gas plants. We will have to phase them out fully by 2050, because in 2050, our power mix, which is optimized to minimize the complete cost of the power system, will rely on two legs. The first leg is renewables, so typically wind, solar, biomass, and hydro. And those are great because they are cost effective, but most of them actually come also with challenges because they are intermittent. Most of them, we do not control when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing, and they are pretty diffuse. So this diffuse feature comes actually with increased cost to connect them to the grid and to enhance the grid to integrate them into the power system. So this is why we need a second leg. And for 23% of our energy mix, you will have decarbonized, dispatchable way to produce power, namely decarbonized thermal for 7% of the mix and nuclear power for 16%. Those two technologies are key to make the system sustainable because we want to ensure security of supply. And if you do not have that, the system will suffer blackouts. And those shares are chosen in a way to minimize the cost of the system. And so let me just say a word on nuclear power, because as I've said, it has a key role to play in our optimized power mix in 2050. And it is a challenge. It is an industrial challenge to be at the target in terms of nuclear installed capacity, because in our scenario, we rely on a range between 120 to 150 gigawatts of installed nuclear capacity at the EU27 perimeter. And out of this number, only 15% will come from existing nuclear capacity with a typical lifetime of 60 years. So that means that for the 85 remaining part of this installed capacity will come from either extending operations, so that's what we call long-term operations, or building new nuclear capacities, whether it is large reactors or small reactors. 85% of our installed capacity in 2050 will come from those new levels. And the final word, with two slides on the power system, and this word is flexibility, because another feature, defining feature of our long-term power mix is that it will have to adjust to more exogenous variation. What I mean by exogenous variation is that the more and more you put renewables in the system, intermittent renewables, renewables where you do not control the power production because you do not control the sun and the wind, the more and more the system will have to adjust to ensure the balance between supply and demand, because, as you know, the power system has to balance power supply and demand at each second. Otherwise, you are going to the blackout. And here is the result of our very granular estimate of those flexibility needs. What you have on the left are short-term flexibility needs. And here what you see, so short-term is basically within a day, why basically the fundamentals of your power system do vary from 1 hour to the other one. And what you see on the left-hand side of the slide is that it is because solar PV, because of the penetration of solar PV in the system, those flexibility needs are going to increase by 3 times. And those figures are in gigawatts. Basically, you need to shift other components of your power system, whether it is on the supply and the demand, by basically 400 gigawatts all over Europe to make sure that you address this variation in solar PV production. Now, let me move to the right-hand side of the slide. And here, the timescale is different. Here, it is about flexibility needs on a monthly or even more timescale. And here, the reason why we need those flexibilities is because sometimes the wind might not blow for 3 weeks. It is a low priority event, but it is a non-zero priority event. So we need to calibrate, we need to dimension our power system on that specific event. And so this is why the flexibility needs on the seasonal timescale also increase by 2, which is actually big. So when you have 300 gigawatts of flexibility needs on the seasonal timescale, this is a challenge. And so how to address this challenge? And here also it's the last cocktail I'm going to show you. And this one is a cocktail of flexibility technologies. On the left, the cocktail is basically based on 2 ingredients: batteries, so physical batteries, whether they are within a car or stationary, and demand-side management, basically ways to make the demand, our power demand, flexible. And so this is why we are not that worried in addressing this challenge, despite very high needs, because those 2 ingredients will do the trick. Whereas on the right-hand side of the slide, for the seasonal flexibility, here, the 2 ingredients I just mentioned, batteries and demand-side management, will not do the trick. So we will need other sources. And here, the 2 players in town we have are basically decarbonized thermal and nuclear. Above and beyond hydro. Hydro will play a role, but above that, you need decarbonized thermal, but it might be costly because it also has a pretty high energy requirement, and nuclear, and as I said, it is a mature technology, but with an industrial challenge. So now, let me move to the conclusion part. Let me go back to the result of our scenario, which is basically the pathway in terms of CO2 emissions towards net zero. Just 2 points as 2 milestones on that slide. So our scenario reaches a minus 50% target in 2030. And as far as the 2040 milestone is concerned, it reaches minus 80%. It is conceivable to increase the ambition up to minus 90% at this date, at the 2040 date. But in that case, we need to be aware of 2 things. First, that it will be costly. We need to be explicit about that. And second, it will be a case for being even more optimized. So on the enablers I've put on the right, we will need to be even more ambitious and proactive on those enablers because they will be necessary conditions to achieve that target. And those enablers are very ambitious electrification strategy, very robust and high and visible CO2 pricing, a legislation that is neutral in terms of technology to make sure that we do not introduce biases that would incur additional costs. We need to rely on technology and innovation because some technologies are not mature yet, typically carbon capture technologies. And we need to do all that while being mindful about the competitiveness of our industry and the purchasing power of households, especially vulnerable households. So that's a challenge. What if, that's the last exercise I'm going to share with you, what if we do not fulfill those conditions? Typically the first one, what if we lag behind on electrification? So let's assume we lag behind by 20% compared to our electrification target in 2050. In that case, we're going to lose on 3 fronts. On the climate front, we will basically delay the reaching of net zero by 10 years. We will also lose on the economic front because despite missing the target on climate, it will be even costlier to engage towards that route compared to our normative optimized scenario. The power system will cost actually plus 20% more in this dystopic variant. And this cost will be borne by public finance, which is a challenge as we know. And third, we will lose on the sovereignty front because we will still be dependent on fossil fuel, on fossil gas actually, and 60 billion cubic meters is actually a high number. It's almost half of our former dependency on the Russian pipe gas. So this is definitely dystopic. We do not want this scenario to happen. We want that scenario to happen. So let me just flash you, for the sake of time, the key figures. And let me just conclude with this call for action. We need to accelerate this roadmap on all domains of the energy sector. On demand, we need to reduce final energy demand. We need to massify electric solutions. We need to accelerate on supply because we need to install more renewables, more nuclear capacity, and more emerging technologies such as CCS, e-fuels. We need to accelerate on grids, I'm sure, and so we will talk about that. And finally, we need on regulation, we need something robust, simple, visible, and predictable, typically a strong CO2 pricing and a legislation that is technology neutral. With further ado, let me stop there and let me open the floor to questions.
Thanks very much, Carl. Some super interesting figures in there. We've gotten a lot of questions in, so I'm going to put these technical questions to you now. First question comes from Marcus Fisher. The 2040 Commission Impact Assessment envisions 89% renewables in power generation for 2050. While considering security of supply, you've arrived at 77%. Why the difference?
Thank you very much for the question. Very relevant question. So I think the first line of answer is that in orders of magnitude, 77% is already a pretty high number. So we fully share the qualitative message of the impact assessment of the Commission that renewables will actually achieve the bulk of power generation by 2050. Now, indeed, 77% is high, but lower than 89%. And here, what we understand from the impact assessment of the Commission, I'm sure Pierre will be very precise and more precise than me on that, is that actually they take nuclear trajectories, nuclear capacities as a given. They do not optimize on the nuclear path because they rely on NECP, National Energy Climate Plans, whereas our scenario actually does optimize on all the technology of power production. So this is a theoretical result that the optimal mix for producing power has a bit more nuclear in our power mix.
Okay, so this next question I think you've just answered, but just to double check. Francesco Salozzi asks, were member states' national targets for generation capacities taken into account when developing the net zero scenario?
And so we do not take national targets as a given. We take it as an anchor, as a reference, but we allow ourselves to actually optimize above and beyond those. So this is why I'm fully aware that this cocktail is a mixture. So because we want to be as normative and as optimized as possible while being still realistic. And by realism, national plans and national policies are part of this realism. So it's a mixture, but the short answer is that actually maybe we optimize even more. So it might be more theoretical than the Commission. And so the two exercises are complementary.
Maybe we can touch upon that in the panel. Next question is from Marcel Kaufman. You mentioned cost effectiveness as a key figure for your scenario. How does that align with the focus on nuclear energy? And how do LCA costs for nuclear compare with more storage, for instance, or other alternatives for nuclear?
So thank you for the question. So indeed, it is a cost minimization exercise, especially as you have seen, it's embedded. We minimize the cost at the energy mix level, and then we minimize the cost at the power mix level. And so it is a complete cost approach. I think the LCOE approach misses the fact that all those technologies of producing power are actually very interconnected. That you cannot think of renewables cost in isolation because you have a lot of indirect additional costs when you put renewables into the system. Typically, the need for backup, the need for grid cost, and so on. And so this is why when I say cost minimization, it is a complete cost minimization. And the intuition behind that is that, as I've said on the flexibility part, that sometimes you might have no wind for 3 weeks. It is a low priority event, but again, a non-zero priority event. In that case, you need some kind of a backup, some kind of dispatchable, decarbonized source of producing power, and nuclear does that. Decarbonized thermal might do that also, but the latter will be costly because it has a lot of high energy requirements.
Okay, the next question is from Giulio Lapera. When studying the evolution of the energy system, did you assess the needs in terms of grid expansion?
So indeed, and so when I'm talking about minimizing the complete cost of the power system, it is including grid cost. So both, cost of connecting renewables to the grid and reinforcing the grid as a whole because there will be more intermittency in the system with electro-technical changes. So yes, we do take into account grid investment in our optimization.
Okay, next question is from Anna Hubert. Can you elaborate on the way you'll electrify buildings on such a big scale? Do the figures on building electrification take into account the situation of countries like Germany, which rely massively on gas boilers?
So we are fully aware that it is a challenge to multiply by 10, the number I've put on the screen, by 10 the number of houses that will be benefiting from heat pumps by 2050 compared to 2021. This is a challenge. We have followed quite closely what happened and what is happening in Germany. In France, it's basically the same political issue, that it is definitely not easy to change your habit. So when you somehow incentivize up to forcing households to change and to renovate and to switch from gas boiler to heat pumps, this is costly financially and socially. So Anna Hubert is right that it is a challenge. It is a normative view, and so we take it as a challenge. Still, in a cost-effective way, we do think that that's the priority, is to electrify buildings.
Okay, next question comes from Moritz Mund. To what extent have you included energy imports from outside the EU in the decarbonization scenario, especially hydrogen and its derivatives?
So thank you for the question. So we try to be as resilient as possible. So we try to minimize our dependency to energy imports, especially on fossil fuel imports. So typically when I say in our dystopic variants that we rely on 60 BCM of gas, this is bad news. This is something we try to avoid in our optimized scenario. This is about fossil fuels. And then about H2 and e-fuel, we also try not to import it too much to be resilient. And so this is also why we might have some diverging views with other scenarios, because in our scenario, most of the H2 and e-fuels are produced domestically based on electrolysis. So it actually consumes power within our European perimeter, and this has a cost. But we do think that the alternative also has cost, economic cost and geopolitical cost.
Next question is from Florie Gonsolon. Significant amounts of electricity will go to non-energy uses such as hydrogen as feedstock. How do you factor this? So electricity going to produce hydrogen for other purposes.
So we do take it as, into account. So at some point on the slides, there's a small star when we actually added 180 terawatt-hour of H2 for feedstocks in the industry. So indeed, we are fully aware that there's a use, and so there's energy demand for this use. And so short answer is yes, we do take it into account. This comes into the share that will be addressed by synthetic molecules, H2 and e-fuels, because there are no solutions for now for this use. And it will also come as a cost, but it is taken into account in the optimization.
Okay, great. So the last question, it's not for you, Charles. Don't worry, you're off the hook now. It's a technical question from Pierre De Vici. To online participants, are we able to download the slides? Yes. You'll see right now at the top of your Slido, I am highlighting the link that you can click on, and then you can download all of those slides. So thank you, Charles, so much for the presentation and answering those questions for us. So now we're going to move on to the panel. I'd like to welcome up the panelists to discuss all of these future issues for Europe's energy system. I'd like to welcome here to the podium Catherine Bauby, who is Strategic Director for EDF. Yeah, great, that's fine. Professor Marc-Oliver Betzuga, who is Director and General Manager at the Energy Industry Institute at Cologne University. We have Pierre Schellekens, who is Director of Energy Policy for Strategy and Coordination at the European Commission's Energy Department. And we have Sonia Toig, who is General Secretary at ENSO-E, which represents the 40 electricity transmission system operators from 36 different European countries. So thank you all so much for joining us for this panel. Professor Betzuga, let's start with you to get an academic perspective on all of this. You're a seasoned expert in energy and climate modeling. What are your first reactions to the EDF scenario that we've just heard?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, obviously, I have to say that it uses a lot of effort to come up with such a kind of comprehensive scenario. So the first reaction is, of course, congratulations to EDF and the team for accomplishing this exercise. Now, in terms of content, I should say that the scenario presented, in my view, belongs to the family of techno-economic target scenarios. And it's obviously not the first one, and Charles also mentioned this. And compared to the other scenarios that are around, structurally, it comes to pretty much the same conclusions, with an important role, especially for electrification to play, and then obviously for an increase in low-carbon electricity production technologies. So I think that, and the role of hydrogen, I'm sure we'll speak about this later. So structurally, it is relatively similar. Now, it was already mentioned in the details of the technology mixes. You of course can find a lot of also then sort of technical details that you might discuss, assumptions that one might challenge and discuss. For example, the relatively high share of nuclear compared to other scenarios, the adoption of CCS in the power sector compared to other scenarios. Also, the mix of biogas and hydrogen. Could be discussed then sort of on a more detailed level. And then finally, I would say, as in all the other scenarios, these techno-economic target scenarios actually lead you to ask new questions, and essentially you did this at the very end. And these are questions around what are the conditions for implementing this techno-economic scenario, which comes from a partial modeling of the energy sector, and obviously the energy sector sits in the larger economy, and the larger economy sits in the larger society. And so these questions include, as you mentioned, sort of from a microeconomic perspective, the question, how will this enormous build-up of assets, new assets and refurbished assets, actually happen? I mean, in the model, it's a central planner who does the investments. In the real world, it's 1 million of asset owners that have to take those investment decisions. And then this, of course, leads you to ask, how do you enable these decisions? How do you incentivize investors to do what the modeler wants them to do? The second question I think that derives is the macroeconomic part, right? If you embed this partial economic energy view into the larger economy, and you think about the European economy to have to make all those investments, so devoting capital and labor into rebuilding the energy sector, then obviously this capital and labor is not available to do other things. Yeah? And so you would need significant productivity gains in the European economy to be able to actually go through this kind of investment. And so the question then from a macroeconomic perspective is, where do we expect those productivity gains in the European economy to come from? And the last question I would like to mention in that context is sort of the broader social embeddedness. So there are, as you mentioned on, I think on your very last slide, distributional concerns. So who's paying? Who's taking the burden? Obviously, a disruptive development creates distributional effects. Also, the question: how does this fit to other political priorities? For example, a priority to invest into our military capabilities, especially in the short term, or the political priority to engage into a just and fair transition, so to make sure that nobody gets sort of overburdened by the cost that are coming from these investments, because obviously the investor wants to be refinanced, so somebody has to carry that cost one way or the other. I think these are very important follow-up questions, and scenarios such as the one presented build a wonderful basis to then engage in further analysis of these questions.
That's a really interesting point about diverted capital and labor. It's all about where you're placing priorities, and that's where the rubber's going to hit the road, I think, in the coming years for sure. Pierre, let's turn to you next. So it was already brought up in the Q&A with Charles that the Commission has published its own analysis for a 2040 climate target. Recently, it has its own scenarios. So what is the dynamic that's going to be set in motion to ensure that carbon neutrality is achieved by 2050? And do you agree with the key drivers that have been outlined in this scenario? How well do they match up with the Commission's thinking?
No, I think broadly speaking, they match quite well. I think it's always important to understand the value of a modeling exercise. Very often I get questions about, you say 87, they say 89. Who's wrong? Who cares? In the sense that the importance of a modeling exercise is to provide information of a trend, of a general tendency. And as Charles was saying, the two exercises that our exercises and that of EDF are slightly different. There are many common points. But the big difference, of course, is that we are working, the Commission, much more in a constrained environment. And that constrained environment is constrained by political decisions. So while the EDF scenario, and correct me if I'm wrong, Charles, is very much an optimum scenario, we have the optimum scenario as part, but we have to mitigate it. Sometimes, I'm hesitant to use the word mitigated, but we have to put it in the context, rather, of political decisions. Right? And that leads us, for instance, on nuclear to have slightly lower figures, because simply, I'll give you the example, we can't put in there the fact that the minister in some member states says, I'm going to build a nuclear power plant. If we were to build our modeling on that, we need to put in things that are government decisions. We need to build ourselves on the credible picture of what has been decided. So we used indeed, as Charles was saying it, we used the 2019 National Energy and Climate Plan. On nuclear, however, those that have read it carefully, we modified it a bit by taking in government decisions that had been taken or national decisions, national laws, taken until the publication of the document. So the French law of June 2023 is in there. So it's slightly higher on nuclear than had been only the NECPs. Now, so just to say, I'm a bit surprised to see that actually, and I completely agree with when Charles says and when the model says electrification, our electrification is even higher than EDF. We rather see a doubling power consumption between now and 2040. So we are a bit higher on electrification. Broadly speaking, however, we are in the same ballpark. Yeah? We are in the same ballpark. There's not a huge difference. And then of course, what is the enablers? Well, first of all, the enablers is, and that is indeed the case now, implementation of what is in the statute books, what is in the laws. So that is 2030, the Fit for 55 legislation, and then looking at the enablers. So that these are issues such as how do we make sure that the transition is just? How do we make sure that we have a competitiveness of the industry? How do we look at the levers of transition, the grids, the skill dimension, and so forth? These are the kind of conditions that we are now looking at in a phase coming into the new. I like the way you put it, Marion, European cycle. I don't kind of 5 years in the sense that in that cycle. We're going to focus in a completely different way on implementation.
Yeah, let's come back to this issue of the NECPs and where they should factor into these predictions. I think it's quite interesting. Sonia, let's go to you next. So we already had a question about the grids in response to the scenario, and we know that one of the big determinative factors about success here is going to be whether the grids, the networks can adapt to the new landscape that's coming. So what would you say are the particular challenges that networks will have to face in the coming years with all of these various predictions that we're having?
Well, Dave, it's a huge challenge. It's a transition that is, monumental in terms of investment euro amount, so the financing part. So you're doubling double-digit investment by each TSO, by each operator in Europe. You're also looking at the connection of those renewable sources and how fast they can connect. Already behind the meter connection is growing enormously. And therefore, for operators, they're also asking the question, how can we unlock the flexibility of those resources connecting? So the sooner we can work with the industry on the services that those connecting generation can give us, as Charles showed, the short and the longer term flexibility that's necessary. The big question for Europe is competitiveness, especially going into the new cycle, as we say, which is can we together build the manufacturing capacity in Europe? Can we compete on a world scale with China, with America, with all sorts of parts of Europe, who are all decarbonizing as well and who are all trying to scale their investments the same? It is important for the operators to step up and resolve the challenges that they have already today. But as you see in Europe, ENSOE has published its offshore network development plans for all the sea basins of Europe in January. The big majority is in the North Sea. So if you think about it as a type of centralized generation will come from the North Sea into Europe, and therefore the question is between onshore and offshore investment and how you can manage the two. Very important for the consumer here is that there are no regrets, okay, with what we do today, and that it is a cost-effective solution. So we are trying to also ensure that the economic basis for what we do has, the robustness in the longer term. But our 10-year network development plan or future development plan says that for every 6 billion euro per year investment, you get 9 billion euro back in socioeconomic gain. So infrastructure is needed, the grid is needed, and of course to unlock for the consumer a much cheaper price and in the long run a more stable, resilient system.
So Catherine, let me get you to respond to some of the responses we've heard so far. In particular, I think this point about the NECPs and how seriously to take national pronouncements, the pronouncements of a minister. How do you make predictions based on government policy? Where do you draw the line between government policy and government ambition?
Yes. So first, let me thank Charles for his very clear presentation. We're very delighted at EDF to have the opportunity to present our scenario for an efficient pathway towards carbon neutrality in Europe by 2050. Thank you also to Marc-Oliver, to Pierre, and Sonia for their useful comments and for being here today to discuss our scenario. I will come back to your question in a few seconds. First, I wanted to point the fact that I think we all agree that if we want to pull off the transition, electrification must take top priority. But actually, if you look at the number, we are not on the right track. I think that the share of electricity in final energy consumption in Europe has been stagnating around 20% for the past few years. Yep. But our scenario shows that we need to reach 60%. Pierre said it's a little higher in his scenario. I think in the same ballpark, 60%. So we are not on the right track. And our study also shows that if we delay any further electrification, then there will be very costly consequences. And I think we cannot afford to have a more costly transition. So I think the top priority is, yes, to have a plan for direct electrification in all the sectors of the economy. As Charles explained, the technologies are there. They need to be deployed massively. And so we really need to push for electrification first so that we can reach carbon neutrality. And this, we also need to promote smart electrification. As Charles explained, we will need more short-term flexibility, and so consumers have to be more active to bring flexibility in the power system. So coming back to your question, is how do we meet this increased demand for low-carbon electricity? So there is the MECP. In our scenario, and I like to point that it is a normative scenario, but it is not a theoretical scenario. We really have a very detailed bottom-up approach. We look at all the countries. Of course, we look at the political ambition, but we actually look at the technologies. It's a strong technological scenario, but it is also an economic scenario. And then what we try to do is we look at the numbers. It's a very economic approach. We have a whole team of economic analysts. Some of them are here today. And so we really we take into account industrial constraint, feasibility constraint. We take into account the political ambition. But in the end, what we do is we try to minimize the cost of the energy transition and of the cost of the power system. And that's why at the end, we have numbers that are a little bit different from the one from the European Commission. But we reach carbon neutrality in Europe by optimizing and minimizing the cost for the society. As Sonia touched upon, I think, of course, if we want to succeed in the electrification journey, of course, we will need to invest heavily in networks, both transportation and distribution networks. So that will be one of the challenges. And I just wanted to come back to one point. We talked a lot about electricity electrification. That will be only 60% of the energy mix. Charles explained that then we will have a cocktail of other solutions. I think that's one of the differences maybe between all the scenarios mentioned by Marc-Oliver. Of course, there will be bioenergy. That's one thing. We need to have sustainable bioenergy. I just wanted to highlight the fact that we really need to invest heavily on innovation, because what we show is that to reach carbon neutrality, a part of those 40% that are apart from electricity are not there yet. So technology do not exist. So we need to invest heavily in disruptive technology, CCS, e-fuels, that are needed to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, but have yet to prove their scalability, their affordability, their profitability. And so also there is a big message of investing in innovation.
Let's talk a little bit about the enablers that are needed to get us where we're going. One of the questions I didn't have time to put to Charles was about consumer behavior and how much changes in consumer behavior will affect the predictions here. Of course, it's not just consumer behavior that needs to change. It's business behavior, it's government behavior, it's all types of different incentives that need to be given to various parts of society. So, Pierre, from the Commission's viewpoint, are there sufficient incentives in place right now for people, businesses, even buildings, architects, you name it, to go over to the electric solutions, for instance, that were envisioned as part of the scenario? And if not, what could be done to provide better or more incentives?
I mean, there are incentives, and some of it is regulatory. We have now nearly finalized the adoption of the Energy Performance of Building Directive. There's a lot of electrification in there. The Alternative Fuels Directive, there's electrification in there. So when you look at different pieces of European legislation, there are indeed, I mean, there is strong support for electrification in these pieces of legislation. That is also the case with some legislation at national level. But absolutely, you're absolutely right. Electrification for the moment is rather stagnating. I think one could see that we're doing rather well on individual measures. And I think what is missing, where we're doing less well, is the whole energy system integration. There, I think there's a need to look at it with more emphasis in the next period, in the next mandate. So issues that will be important, I completely agree with you. Grids, as I mentioned before, the whole demand side. I thought that was a very strong point of your presentation, Charles. The whole flexibility side, where we indeed have concerns. That we are not moving fast enough for actually to really exploit the advantages of renewables into the network, the demand side of things. But I think one of the issues where not to crack in the coming years will still be this energy system integration, because that is a basis for a much higher electrification of the energy demand, and there it's not going that fast. It's going better. I think we rather encouraging science on, as I said, on individual measures, but how we link it all together is, I think, an issue that we need to look at with more political focus. And that applies to us, but applies nearly even more to the national level.
Yeah. For sure. Mark Oliver, we've talked a lot about how, in this scenario, electrification is the big thrust, but then there's this cocktail of other uses, so bioenergy, hydrogen, and its derivatives on these specific uses. Would you say that, in your view, does the scenario get the balance right there between electrification and those other uses, that cocktail part?
That's hard to judge from what has been presented in terms of detail. As I said, sort of the general ingredients to the mix are pretty much the same in all the scenarios. The main direction of travel is also pretty much the same in all scenarios. So a significant increase in the share of electricity is required, both because of the efficiency gains that come from electrification, and because of the fact that the low carbon primary energy that is available only comes through the electricity vector. So it's obvious that in a target scenarios you find that electrification goes up. Now, if you then ask yourself the question, what's the exact right mix between those sort of molecules and the electrons, then I would say from a modeler perspective, it is in the details of the assumptions, of the cost assumptions, and especially the cost assumptions for those technologies that are not yet mature. And thus, it is impossible to say sort of the balance is right or wrong, in the sense of that there is a true or false that we already know with some certainty at this point in time. Therefore, I think the point that was raised, that we need some kind of neutrality with respect to exploring both the exact mix between electricity and molecules, and more importantly, even within the molecules, including the question that was asked by the audience before: what is the right mix of imports and production of e-fuels, for example, here at home in Europe? These are questions where we, from the current perspective, would not be able to pinpoint the exact trajectory, but rather need the market and market innovation to explore the correct sort of the most economic balance for the continent.
Sonia, we know that we've heard that the grids, the TSOs, they're a key part of this transition, right? What are the challenges that exist right now in terms of permitting, acceptability, funding that need to be addressed in order to meet the objectives that the EU has set in terms of ramping up electrification and delivering decarbonization?
Well, a lot of it is captured within the EU Grid Action Plan, so you can reference that for sure. And of course, ENTSO-E has a very strong role in the action plan and implementing aspects of it. One of the key things, of course, is around anticipatory investments. So we talked there about technologies that are not being mature, and then the risk is not being taken to deploy them. If you wait a long time for this more long-term capital investment, things have moved on the grid, things have moved on with connection. So we are very much calling for revised regulatory framework, or a regulatory framework that provides stability and signals, but also takes some risk, and also ensures that the grid for today, the grid for tomorrow is well planned. And that, of course, the idea that technologies are there in the industry, and so we has a technopedia, so you can actually look at the scale of technology and the maturity level of it, but the regulatory framework to deploy that hasn't moved in that space, and that's what we ask for, and that's what we call for. This is a major part that's already in our gift. If you ask us, some things are out of our control. The permitting is very much a local level matter, agencies, and therefore have to respect also the due process at national level. But the aspect around regulatory, certainly something that we feel very strongly about. Of course, financing, we've discussed this, but again, the aspects of working with industry on manufacturing, those are the big levers. But for us, being a regulated business model, the question is there enough pricing in of the certainty of the stability, but also the anticipation of taking a risk on a technology that might deliver for now a benefit, and therefore not to lead to a higher cost solution in the end. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Catherine, Sonia just mentioned the need for anticipatory investments in particular. There's various ways to deliver those investments. One is CO2 pricing. What's your view on how CO2 pricing is working to deliver on decarbonization investments, particularly given the current level of the CO2 price? Are you seeing it working as a driver for investment?
Well, so if you look at the EU ETS today, the price of CO2 in the EU ETS has been fallen sharply for the past few months. I think we've been oscillating between 50 and 60 euro per ton for the past few weeks. So it is very worrying to me. I think it should be concerning to all of us, because to me it sends a signal that is in complete contradiction with the very ambitious targets set by Europe, reaching carbon neutrality by 2050, 55% reduction in 2030. The proposal of the European Commission to have a 90% reduction in 2040. So to me, yes, the carbon price today is very concerning. I think it is very urgent that the level of the price in the EU ETS comes back rapidly to a level in which we have the right signal, at least for the power sector. We should have a CO2 price level that allows all CCGTs to be called before any coal-fired power plants today in the merit order in the power sector. It is not the case. If we make our own computation, it depends on many different factors, but we think that very urgently we need to have a EU ETS in the range of 80 to 100 euro per ton, and so it's not the case today. But it is not enough to have the right level of CO2 price for the power sector. We also need to have a CO2 price that sends the right signal for investors, for consumers, to switch their use from fossil fuel to electricity. That's what we said before. So we need to have an explicit carbon price especially that's high enough to incentivize the switch between fossil fuel usage to decarbonized solutions. They exist. We have heat pumps to decarbonize buildings. We have electric vehicles to decarbonize transportation, both light and heavy transportation. We also have solutions to decarbonize industrial heat. And so today we need to have a CO2 price for those sectors as well to trigger those investments and decarbonize all sectors of the economy. So if we want to reach 80% reduction in 2040, all the more so if we want to reach 90% reduction, our analysis show that we need to have a CO2 price in the range of 200 to 300 euro per ton in 2040. That is, I think, quite coherent with the CO2 value used in the impact assessment of the European Commission. And so to us, we really need to support energy transition, electrification with a robust CO2 pricing mechanism, and also by implementing, of course, well-targeted redistribution mechanisms so that we also protect the most vulnerable actors of the economy.
Let's talk about flexibility needs. This is something that was envisioned in the scenario, and as Charles mentioned, the sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing, and if you have a big influx of renewables into the grid, you're going to need more steady sources of power in order to balance that out. Mark Oliver, in this scenario, this growing need for flexibility is outlined. What are the drivers for that flexibility need, and then how can that be solved in the most cost-efficient and realistic way possible?
Yes, so the increase in the flexibility need is again a robust finding of all such target neutral scenarios. Main drivers are, on the one hand, the increase in electricity supply that is intermittent. Secondly, the increase in load that comes, so new load that comes with new load profiles that have their own structure to them, so especially battery electric vehicle charging and the heat pumps with the seasonal profile being added to the electricity system. And thirdly, it is driven by the grid constraints. So while, yes, grid will be expanded, the fact that both the renewable supply and the load come in a very decentralized fashion. This means that there is an increased need of grid supply, so grid transporting the electricity between load and demand, but it will not be found to be economic to build the grid to such extent that there will be the same amount of bottlenecks as today. So we will have to take into account from an economic perspective that there will be more bottlenecks, especially in the distribution grid level. And this, of course, also increases flexibility needs in order to sort of work around those bottlenecks. In terms of enablers and priorities for enablers, I should say there are probably three that I would point to. Number one, you need a liquid power price signal on as granular a temporal and spatial scale as possible. And this power price signal also needs to be as undistorted by levies and charges as possible, in order to allow the most efficient use of the flexibility options that there are. Secondly, since we probably will not be able to have such liquid power price signal on a spatial level that is a transformer station, so there will be some intermediate and lower level below sort of the wholesale price, where we will need the grid operators to come up with incentives for the flexible consumers and the flexible producers to react to what is going on. So there must be an enabling of the grid operators to be able to fulfill their task, which will probably also require to rethink some of the very strict unbundling rules that we currently have in place. And then thirdly, you need to have, and that comes back to the general issue of investment incentives. There needs to be a microeconomic incentive for the investors into the flexibility options to actually do these investments. Yeah. And this is, I think, a very tricky challenge because the assumption that wholesale prices alone even in combination with CO2 prices, will give you sufficient visibility for the investors that they require to engage into a risky investment over which has a lifetime of, say, 15, 20, or 25 years, is probably optimistic. So there will be the need to come up with incentive mechanisms that go beyond pure wholesale price plus CO2 ETS price signals in order to make sure that we get those flexibility needs. And then again, we will have the grid operators on the table, because the grid operators have the information where these flexibility needs generate most value. Yeah? And then the grid operators actually have to talk to each other between electricity and gas and hydrogen and heat, to make sure that they actually localize those investments at the right places and size them in the right way. So the planning intensity that is required to make this economically efficient is quite high.
So this flexibility need issue was actually specifically mentioned by President Macron this morning at the nuclear summit. And he was speaking specifically in the context of nuclear, but of course more general needs. But when I was there at the summit this morning, I couldn't help thinking, as we had these grand pronouncements from the various prime ministers that are part of the nuclear alliance, some of them are coming from countries that are starting from very low point, zero in terms of some of them. And so, Pierre, I want to put this question to you. This scenario that we've just heard puts a big emphasis on much higher nuclear installed capacity than we have today, and then also higher than the Commission scenario, which accounts for 71 gigawatts in 2040 and 2050 based on the 2019 NECPs. From the Commission's perspective, again, referring back to what you said before, based on real plans in place rather than political pronouncements, does the Commission plan to broaden the spectrum of its scenarios in terms of nuclear capabilities in the future?
I mean, what we so we talked about the fact that we're going for a strong electrification in our model. And in our model, and compliance with the target there, builds on the notion that by 2040, power is decarbonized. By 2040, not later on. And that means that we need all zero or low carbon electrons that we can have, that we can produce. And therefore, I think the 2040 communication is very clear on the notion that this is the direction we're going. So all decarbonized electrons are welcome in the system, right? And then we okay. If you look at the NECPs, indeed, you said it's when you have 78 or 80. The variant with the government or national decisions over summer gave us 17 extra gigawatts, 18 extra gigawatts, out of which 17 are French. Yeah. So it's a bit. There's a bit in Finland and Hungary, but what's going to happen is simply that we are now soon having the final NECPs, and when we come back to this issue, when we start looking at what kind of legislation, what kind of assessment, we are going to come back to this modeling, and then of course we'll take into account the revised NECPs. And that will give us a broader picture. But also be a bit careful on this, because if you look at, there is an increase, but if you look, keep in mind that nuclear does a bit of a U-turn over the 2020s and 2030s. There's a moment where it goes down and then it goes up again, right? And that is notably built on decisions, political decisions by some member states. Yeah. So this is what we see, and so I think one should be very calm about the issues of nuclear, of course, with all the safety conditions applied. I think very calm about it and see how it evolves, and it's part of the picture. Whether we then end up at 100, 120, 150, as some say, Let's see. But we'll take into account whatever comes in as government or national decisions. That's the only thing we could do, and I think in a credible way.
Well, speaking of those national decisions, Sonia, as we hear so often, the EU is a diverse group of countries that have very different ways of organizing themselves, be it as governments or as energy distributors. We know some countries are more centralized and some countries are more decentralized. And of course, energy, however they choose to do that, is a national competence. But I wonder, what kind of difference does that make for the TSOs in terms of delivering these changes we've been talking about? Is it harder in the more decentralized countries or vice versa? And then also when we're thinking about the actual raw materials that are needed to expand the grid infrastructure to meet all of this new energy coming online, where do those raw materials come from? Is there a risk of developing a dependency for the things that are needed for lines, for cables, for transformers? How are the TSOs looking at where that's going to come from?
Well, I guess you could look at that from many angles. There's many parameters at play in any national context, and then the question is at European level. But we, of course, have all aligned with the decarbonisation objective, so we have one common goal. The question is, how do you get there? And of course, countries have even geology and geographical differences. You know, how much water they have, how much coal they have, how much interconnection they have. So I think what we try to do, of course, amongst all the operators is say, well, if you invest in interconnection, you get more inflexibility and you get more resilience in your system and security. So you can see in continental Europe, it's an interconnected system. You see how Ukraine connected in with the system, and that gave it security even to defend itself. So interconnection and synchronized system is where it comes. Of course, within jurisdictions, there are variations of political persuasion in terms of the generation mix, nuclear, not nuclear. What type of, the German government has made a very strong stance on renewables-focused portfolio, but of course it understands itself in terms of how it transitions. So I think as part of transition, we would encourage, of course, a portfolio question, and also a question about resilience more generally for scenarios and planning, and scenarios in terms of what-ifs. And I think that's as an operator, that's our role, which is to ensure that the system itself can be provided as secure as possible, even independent of what we may call the political developments on the day. And I think that is the importance. That we are technology neutral, we're fuel neutral, we are looking at decarbonization as a global goal. And I think across Europe, that is the objective that everyone has, and within NSOE we are united on that.
We know that the EU has two big overriding objectives right now, both decarbonization and security of supply. Security of supply for obvious reasons over the past couple of years. Catherine, what would you say are the key requirements for the EU to get to and maintain a high level of security of supply?
So when you talk about security of supply, I think that as Charles explained during his presentation, we can see two different time horizons. For the short-term flexibility and security of supply within the day, within the week, of course we will see a huge increase in the need. But as Charles explained, we have the technologies, so of course we need to have the enablers to implement massively those levers, storage and demand response. But it is not a big concern to us. I think we should not underestimate the challenge of seasonal flexibility and the security of supply with the seasonal time horizon. For this seasonal levers, we have nuclear. We talked about it. It is a way to bring seasonal flexibility because you can schedule a maintenance shutdown during periods of lower demands. So that's one of the solutions. Some countries use it, some countries don't use it. The second lever is hydropower, because you can finally manage the water storage in the reservoir. Some countries have hydropower, some don't. It's just a resource in the country. And so we should not underestimate that in the end, especially for countries for which nuclear or hydro is not a solution, we need to rely on thermal assets to reach the security of supply and seasonal flexibility. And so it is very important that we have also the enablers, the levers, to develop heavily decarbonized thermal power plants. Charles showed the number rapidly on the screen. We are talking hundreds of gigawatts. So I think today we need to have European rules that incentivize all low carbon technology that bring security of supply, that bring decarbonized power generation. And so we need to have technologically neutral European rules and policy to incentivize all those technology. They will all be needed for security of supply.
Okay, let's take some questions that have come in from the audience for the panel. Again, you can put your questions in Slido and I'll put them to the panelists up here. So on the same topic of materials required for the transition that we were just talking about, we have a question here from Elizabeth Huffer. Pierre, I'll put this question to you first. To what extent do the scenarios, the Commission and the EDF scenarios, take into account the limits on the availability of the materials required for the transition, given that the worldwide demand for these will increase?
That's a good question. And it's one that we've worked on a lot, actually, because there are a couple of, when you talk about resources and so forth, I think there are several dimensions. You could talk about, for instance, the whole biomass side of things. And there you have different uses. And I think Charles was hinting at it as well. So where do you strike the balance between these different uses? Another issue is actually land use, availability of space here as well. And that's another issue where I think you need to know where is the balance. So we try, these are different scenarios. So we tried with the different scenarios, you have differences in these parameters, right? What we've suggested is keep in mind, is a recommendation for a general climate target. This is not the policy architecture of the future. This is something that is going to come with a new commission. And when we do, now we have information in the impact assessment about these can I call them trade-offs between different users and so forth? And there, when we then start looking at the legislation as such, you need to know, based on this information, where you strike a balance. But I think it's one of these issues. I'm not saying it's keeping me up at night, but it is a very serious. Very few things do, but it's a very serious issue. This issue from the land use aspect, the material aspect of there is a finite amount of, for instance, biomass in Europe under sustainable circumstances, right? And you see also, for instance, that there are other interesting uses than just the energy sector. We are starting to build houses again in wood, right? That was gone for many years, except in my own country in Sweden and Finland. But that is coming back. And that is also interesting from a climate perspective, because it is basically, it is storing CO2 in a medium-term way. And so I think the question is good because you need it hints at the fact that there are still many of these equilibriums that you need to find.
The same question for you in terms of EDF's outlook. How does EDF see the resource issue there?
So it's quite the same, I think, as done by Pierre's team. We modelize, again, a bottom-up approach where we looked at the different resources in the European country which we modelize. I think the other part of your question is about the fact of the material that we need for the, for example, renewable assets that come from other countries and parts of the world. And so we need to look at the resources in the global perspective, not only European scenario, but a worldwide scenario, because it's the same material, the same resources that will be needed for all the countries that we'll all need to reach at some point carbon neutrality, and we are all developing heavily the same kind of technology. So, so we have a very a detailed model for the European resources, and we also try to look at the global material perspective. I think that the IEA is doing extensive work on that. We, of course, rely on this kind of studies as well. But, of course, it's a long way ahead of us because it's a very challenging question. So we are starting to do that. But, of course, we have still much work to do in the years to come on that topic.
Okay, let's take the next question here. Actually, the question is from Marion up here. The question is to Pierre. Can you explicitly tell us... It's a little odd. It's a short conduit I'm making here. So the question is, can you explicitly tell us the Commission's approach to determine the amount of CCS, carbon capture and storage, in its scenario?
Listen, I mean, we build ourselves on one hand on the NZIA, which has a target for CCS, as you know, the 50, if I'm not mistaken, the 50 million tons by 2030. So that was a kind of assumption because it's in legislation, right? And another issue which I, of course, have not been completely clear with, of course, all of our modeling as well assumes full compliance with legislation. Because as guardians of the treaties, what else are we to do? So we put that in, and then we looked at different cost-efficient scenarios, which brought us down to different levels of CCS. I don't quite exactly remember the figure. I think it's 300. But where a lot of it is in industry, but then some of it is indeed also in the energy sector.
Okay.
And that is a condition. There are, I think, in some member states, there are plans to continue to maintain a certain level of gas-powered. And then, if you want to then reach, if you want to combine that with what I said before, that the power sector needs to be decarbonized, that's what you get.
All right, so the next question is to Catherine. This question is from JR. How do you reconcile your assumptions on the It's this mystery of a questioner. So the question is, how do you reconcile your assumptions on the reduction of demand with the big needs of the transport sector, notably aviation? We know that transport emissions keep growing. The last scenario shows that only for aviation, several hundreds of terawatt hours will be needed. How do you answer that?
So we actually modeled finally this topic. What we looked in Charles' presentation is the numbers for final energy demand, but we also modeled the fact that we will need a lot of power generation to produce e-fuels that will then be used in the maritime and aviation sectors. So it is completely taken into account. And so when what we said is that the final energy demand will be reduced by 40%. It includes the fact that for maritime and aviation, we will need to produce e-fuel that will need, in turn, a lot of power generation. And so that is embedded in our scenario.
Okay, last question here before we wrap up. I'm going to put to Mark Oliver. So it's about the possibility for a 100% renewable scenario. We hear a lot about this idea that we could have a 100% renewable scenario. Do you think such a scenario is possible? Is that a realistic idea?
Well, there exist such scenarios, right? So on paper, you find such scenarios in the literature. And also, you would then find that there might even be cost optimal, depending on what kind of cost assumptions you put in for various technologies, right? And since the future is uncertain at present, it's impossible to decide which one of those scenarios is sort of true in an academic sense. So yes, it is possible to deliver the kind of energy services that were included in your model without taking resource to power CCS and to nuclear. On a scenario, on a paper basis.
Right.
Obviously, in most of these scenarios, you would find that imported hydrogen plays a larger role than it probably does in the scenario that you have. You haven't been explicit about this, but from your remarks and the amount of hydrogen that is in your model, I would assume that sort of in such scenarios you would typically, especially if you think in terms of cost efficiency and allow for certain import prices for hydrogen, you would probably account for a higher share of imported hydrogen in the mix. So then again, you are in this sort of detailed discussion around what happens in the structure of the results on a more detailed scale.
Well, I note that there's still a number of technical questions in here for Charles, but if they're from people in the room, the good news is that I think he's staying around for the networking drink. So grab him out there. You can ask him those questions. If any of these questions have come from people online, you've got the link there for the report. I'm going to re-up that again so you can see it very clearly. And I'm sure you can get in touch on there. Charles would be happy to answer your questions. So I want to thank our panelists for some really interesting interventions. How about a round of applause for them? And to close us out, I would like to welcome to the podium Luc Raymond, who is EDF's chairman and chief executive officer. Mr. Raymond?
I'll put the podium aside, if you don't mind. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you for your participation. Really glad to be here tonight, benefiting from this moment and the summit that we had today about nuclear, which is first of a kind, showing that technology agnosticity can also lead to sometimes put a word on a technology that was since few years a bit forbidden in few places, including in Europe. So I'm glad that we have an open discussion about all technologies today. As I'm sure you have discussed today, the work that has been done on forecasting is not meant to promote one technology or another. It's just to find realistic ways of achieving what is our common goal. And our common goal is really to have a sustainable level of energy in the future with low carbon, because this is what should drive all of us. And that's the mission of EDF, no other mission. The mission of EDF is to provide the sustainable low carbon energy that is needed by our fellow citizens in Europe. So we are trying to give our part of light. Of course, this is not the truth. This is just part of the light that we can shed on the future. Of course, this is wrong. Of course, because any forecast is wrong. And the future is always more difficult to predict than the past. So that's why we take very smart people like Charles, Catherine, and others to try our best to shed some light on the future, on what is possibly to our future and what we could possibly achieve in the future together. That's really the purpose of what has been disclosed today, which has been a very deep work. So thank you for the work. Thank you, Charles. Thank you to all the economist team at EDF for this very deep work. And what we are trying to do is to gather as much information as we can to make accurate forecasts on where could our sector go, where could energy and electricity go. Now, we are also in business, so it means that once we have the forecast, we have to make business and industry decisions. That's what we are in. And there, of course, we have to move from prediction to reality and permanently adapt our reality to what is effectively occurring. And what I would like to share with you here is the few principles where we should guide our activity in the future in order to make this journey together towards low carbon energy and sustainable development with low carbon energy the most successful possible in Europe. First, I would like to say there are great news. Great news over the last few years. The first one is that there is ambition and there is a common ground in Europe to take a very serious ambition towards carbon neutrality. And that's really something that we want to put at EDF our steps in, because this is fully aligned with our values. EDF today is emitting 37 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. This is probably the best in class in the world, being fully dispatchable at the same time. We consider this is not enough. We want to continue to improve. So we have taken the commitment to go down to 30 grams by 2030, and even below by 2035, because we want to be at 22 by 2035. So that's the journey we are in, and we are going to continue to work on our portfolio of technologies so that we can achieve this goal and do as much as we can. What defines EDF is not necessarily that we are going to produce all the electricity that is needed. What defines EDF is that we have the know-how. We are an electrician since ever, and we are specialized in low-carbon electricity since ever. So we want to leverage our know-how with partners, with other utilities, with other companies who want to invest into electricity, so that we have the biggest possible impact thanks to our know-how. That's what we are going to try to achieve in the coming years. Now, of course, we will achieve that only if we are in the right framework, if we work with the good rules, if we are able to develop the right projects. And in this respect, I think we have seen over the last 2 to 3 years, thanks to the lessons learned of the crisis, some very good steps made at European level, which frankly I would like to commend. The first one is the ambition. The second one is the technology agnosticity of the market rules that have been defined last year. This is the first time that we have that, technology agnostic, looking at the long term rather than just the short-term market of electricity. These are very good steps. Now, if we want to sustain long-term investment, which are needed to reduce gradually the number of fossil fuels that we are using, we need, of course, to sustain a vision that is shared for the long run. All of our investments are taking time, some few years, some more than few years. But for all the investments, we need long-term vision, which means that we need a steady direction for many years to be able to develop the infrastructure that is needed to fulfill this objective. Among the things that are needed, carbon vision must be the most stable vision that we have. For this, we need to have a meaningful carbon price. If carbon price drops, means that all the efforts that are made, both on the user side and on the production side for electricity, are going at some point to be put at danger. To give you an example, if the carbon price drops down to the levels to which it reached a few weeks ago, at some point, you have some coal-fired power plants who become more marginal and are triggered before some gas power plants. Makes no sense. And if it lasts for some time, more than a few weeks, then you have investment decisions that are stopped, or new structural decisions that are made by some users because of that. So having a steady direction in our carbon price or carbon value at European level is a must to sustain this long-term decarbonization strategy, which I think we share at European level. Second element, technology agnosticity. I said it, the reality is we don't know what should be the mix in 2050. We don't know. We don't know. We should just develop the mix of technology that makes sense. And as we move forward, we will complement with the technologies that occur. And normally, business people, entrepreneurs are better off making these choices than any planification. So we should go for the long run, taking all the technologies available, testing them for their merits as they complement into a common need that is low carbon. And my third comment is that electricity is a system. Electricity is not just the addition of assets. It doesn't work like an addition of assets. Electricity works as a system. We are a system operator in electricity. An electricity system that works with the right dispatching capacities, the right grid, and the right complement of sources of electricity generation, and the right attitude of the users, because the users become smarter and smarter, and they are part of the systems as well. So one of the biggest challenges that we have ahead of us in the next few years is to make this system resilient in an environment which is more decentralized, with more intermittency coming into the system, with, of course, needs of grid connection that are increasing. All of this needing to be resilient, reliable, in an environment where electricity is more needed. And that's one of the dimensions that is, we try to model it. That's just real life. And it needs to be balanced at the minute, every day, at European scale. And this is why continuing to work in detail so that even though we have plenty of actors into the electrical system, which is a good thing, we keep a resilient approach of our system so that it works efficiently and physically in a balanced way. And that's why we will need a variety of investments and actors who have developed this understanding of the system so that we are not just piling complexity and then facing the challenges of intermittency and instability. That's the elements on which we would like to work with our fellow partners among I'm sure that there are many in this room in the next few years so that we take the challenge of zero carbon, which we really think at EDF is not only worth taking, but also achievable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rimmel, and thank you to all of you for spending your Thursday evening with us on a busy day here in Brussels. We appreciate it. If you're here in the room, I now invite you outside for the networking cocktail. If you're watching us at home, thanks for joining us, and I wish you a great evening. Take care. Thank you. Thanks a lot.